The station had been floating in space for 300 years, and in all that time, it had never seen anything quite like them. The Interstellar Academy of Convergence was not a small place. It stretched for kilometers in every direction with long, silver corridors and tall glass walls that looked out into the endless black of space. Thousands of students walked those corridors every single day. Rethink students with their hard-shell bodies and 6 arms clicking softly as they moved Solanari. Students who glowed faintly blue in the dark like living lanterns. Thargan students who were so large and heavy that the floor shook. A little when they walked, students from 47 different planets had passed through these halls, and the Academy had seen all kinds of strange and wonderful things, but it had never seen humans before, not like this. Not as students, there had been one human before, a nurse named Mara Osei. She had been working in the Academy medical wing for 2 years now. She was a short woman from Lagos with dark brown skin and tired eyes, and a laugh that was too loud for the quiet hallways of the station. The alien faculty had not been sure about her at first. They had reviewed her qualifications with great seriousness, and had several long meetings about whether a human was really suitable for the role. Humans were so new to the galaxy. They had only discovered faster than light travel 40 years ago. They were barely past the infant stage by Galactic standards, but Mara had the qualifications, and she had come very highly recommended, and so they gave her the job 2 years later. The faculty still found her slightly unsettling in a way they could not fully explain. She never seemed afraid of anything. She worked alone. She never called for help. She would look at a sick patient with those tired, calm eyes and say things like, "This is nothing," or "He will be fine in 2 days," as if illness was something boring to her, something she had already beaten so many times it no longer interested her. The alien faculty respected her. They just did not entirely understand her, and now there were 7 more humans. 7 young human students had been admitted to the Academy as part of something called the Galactic Exchange Initiative. It was a new program, a political program designed to make humanity feel welcome in the larger galactic community. The Academy Council had voted on it for 6 months. They had argued about biology, about safety, about whether human students would be able to keep up with the curriculum. They had argued about food and sleeping schedules and the fact that humans needed a very specific range of temperature to function properly. In the end, the vote passed by a narrow margin, and 7 humans arrived on a cold Tuesday morning with large bags and wide eyes, looking at everything like they had never seen anything so incredible in their lives, which they probably had not. Jonah Vasquez was one of them. He was 22 years old, with dark curly hair and a crooked smile, and the kind of face that made him look younger than he was. He was studying xenobiology, which was the science of alien life forms. He had wanted to do this since he was 8 years old, since the day the news announced that humanity had made first contact and the whole world had stopped breathing for a moment. He remembered sitting on the floor of his living room in Mexico City, watching the screen with his mouth open, thinking he wanted to know everything about them. Now he was here, standing in the middle of a hallway inside an actual space station, surrounded by actual aliens, and he could not stop smiling. The alien students looked at the humans the way people look at something they have read about in a book but never actually seen in real life. Curious but careful, interested but unsure. They watched the humans eat. They watched them sleep. They watched them laugh very loudly at things that were not funny by any standard they understood. They watched them trip over things and then stand up and keep walking as if nothing had happened. The Vrethkai student named Kel sat 3 seats away from Jonah in xenobiology class and spent the first week watching him the way a scientist watches something under a glass. She had read everything she could find about human biology before the humans arrived. She had prepared herself. She had thought she was ready. She was not ready for how warm they were. First time she accidentally touched Jonah's hand when they both reached for the same datapad. She pulled back immediately. Her heat sensors had flared. The boy was like a small furnace. How was he not in pain? How was he walking around like that with all that heat inside him? She checked the temperature again. That was normal for them. That was just what they were like all the time. It was very strange, Elder. Sivan, the xenobiology professor, was 312 years old and had been teaching at the academy for most of that time. He was a Solanari, which meant he was tall and thin and faintly glowing and very, very calm. He had seen students from dozens of species. He had watched young Thargan warriors cry on their first day. He had watched Reth students accidentally destroy lab equipment 6 times in one semester. He thought he had seen everything. The humans made him feel like a student again, which he did not entirely like. He watched Jonah during the first week and found the boy strange but impressive. Strange because of the biology. Humans had soft skin, no armor, no shell, no natural defense of any kind. They had no venom, no echolocation, no ability to survive in temperatures below a certain point. They were by galactic standards extraordinarily fragile, and yet there was something in the way Jonah moved. Something easy and unworried, as if the universe had not yet told him he was supposed to be afraid of it, Elder. Sivan made a note in his personal file about the humans. He wrote that they were interesting. He underlined the word twice. The third week of the semester started normally. It was a Tuesday again. The class was halfway through a lecture on the respiratory systems of deep ocean species on Kelara 7. Jonah was taking notes. Kel was watching him take notes. Elder Sivan was talking about gill structure, and then Jonah put his pen down. He pressed his hand to his forehead. He blinked slowly. He looked confused, the way people do when something is wrong, but they cannot quite name what it is yet. He tried to keep his eyes open, and then he slid sideways off his chair and hit the floor. For 1 full second. Nobody moved. And then the room exploded. Kel screamed and jumped backward. Her shell plates slammed together with a sound like cracking ice. 3 Solanari students went completely dark, their glow cutting off like a switch. Their race went dark when they were terrified. The 2 Thargan students at the back stood up. So fast they knocked their desks over and pressed themselves against the far wall. One of them grabbed the door handle, and Jonah lay on the floor, completely still, radiating heat, like a small dying star. Elder Sivan, who'd been in calm for 312 years, looked at the boy on the floor, and for the first time in a very long time felt something cold move through his chest. He hit the emergency beacon code. Crimson biological. Cascade failure imminent. The alarm filled the corridor and kept going, and 3 doors down in the medical wing. A woman with tired eyes looked up from her desk, read the location on her screen, stood up, picked up her bag, and walked out the door at a pace that was not running but was not slow either. The pace of someone who had done this before. The corridor outside the xenobiology lecture hall was empty when Mara Osei turned into it. That was unusual. By this hour, the corridor was usually full of students moving between classes, but the alarm had cleared the hallway, the way water clears when something large moves through it, and now there was nothing but the red pulse of the emergency light on the ceiling and the sound of Mara's shoes on the floor. She pushed open the lecture hall door and stopped for just 1 moment. 43 students were pressed against the far wall like they had been pushed there by a wave. 3 Solanari were completely dark, shivering faintly. Kel, the Vreth Kai student, was making a sound that Mara had learned over 2 years was the Vreth Kai equivalent of hyperventilating, a low continuous clicking. Her shell kept opening and closing. Elder Sivan was standing in the middle of the room, not against the wall, which said something about him, because he looked as pale as a Solanari could look when they were terrified, and 1 Vreth Kai student that Mara did not recognize was holding up a small recording device pointed at Jonah. She found out later that the student had been recording what she believed was a historic event, the first documented death of a human student at the academy. She had already chosen a title for the recording on the floor. In the center of all of this was Jonah Vasquez. He was on his side, his cheek against the cold metal floor, his eyes half open, and his face a deep dark. Red, his skin was sweating. His chest was moving. He was breathing. Mara walked to him. She knelt down. She put the back of her hand against his forehead. She held it there for 2 seconds. Then she pulled out her scanner, ran it over him once, checked the reading, put the scanner away, opened her bag, and took out 2 small white pills and a bottle of water. Elder Sivan stepped forward. His voice was very careful, the way voices get when people are trying not to show how afraid they are. He asked, "What was happening to the student?" Mara looked up at him. "He has a fever," she said. The room made a sound. It was not one sound, exactly. It was many sounds happening at the same time, clicking and dimming, and something from the jargon that was almost like a growl. The student with the recording device took a step forward. Elder Sivan said slowly and clearly that he did not understand what that meant. He said that the student had been radiating dangerous thermal output and had lost consciousness and was clearly in systemic failure. Mara looked at him for a moment. Then she looked around the room. She took in the 43 students against the wall, the darkness of the solinari, the recording device, the overturned desks, the sheer absolute terror. In every face in front of her, she said it again. A fever. Nobody moved. She sat down on the floor next to Jonah, which seemed to alarm everyone further, because apparently sitting on the floor next to a dying organism was not something any of them would have done. She lifted his head gently and helped him drink a little water, and then she put both pills in his hand and told him to swallow them. Jonah blinked at her. He asked in a rough voice if he was at the medical wing. She told him no. "You are in the middle of your xenobiology class." She told him he had fainted. She told him he had a fever. She told him it was going to be fine. He closed his eyes and swallowed the pills. The recording student made a sound that translated roughly as, "This is the most frightening thing I have ever seen." Mara looked up at the room again. She looked at the 43 faces looking back at her. She looked at Elder Sivan, who was standing very still with the expression of a being who has just realized that he may have misunderstood something important and very large. She asked if someone could please bring a chair. Nobody moved for a moment. Then a Thargan student, the one who had pressed himself against the wall, reached out, slowly picked up a chair from near the door and held it out at arm's length toward her, as if she might bite him. She thanked him. He stared at her. She sat in the chair next to Jonah, who was still on the floor because she decided it was better not to move him yet, and she looked. And Elder Sivan asked how much he knew about human biology, said they had covered it briefly in preparation for the exchange program. He said the academy had a file. He said the file had described humans as fragile and highly susceptible to environmental threats. Mara nodded. She said yes, that was not wrong. But there was something the file had probably not explained well enough. She paused for a moment, and then she said something that changed the entire atmosphere of the room. She said, "A fever was not the body failing." She said a fever was the body fighting. There was a long silent scale. The Vreth student stopped clicking. She moved one step forward from the wall, her eyes, which were large and dark and multifaceted, fixed on Mara. She asked Mara to explain what she meant. Mara explained. She said that when something harmful enters a human body, the immune system responds. It identifies the threat, and it does something remarkable. It raises the temperature of the entire body on purpose. It does this because most of the things that make humans sick, bacteria and viruses and parasites, they cannot survive in very high heat. The human body knows this, so it makes itself hotter. It makes itself into an environment where the enemy cannot live. She said the fever was not a sign that Jonah was losing. She said the fever was the weapon. Nobody spoke. Kel took another step forward, then another. Then she was standing at the edge of the group, no longer against the wall, looking down at Jonah on the floor with an expression that was impossible to read on a Vreth face, but which felt something like the moment a locked door opens. She asked quietly if that meant that the human was burning the infection alive from inside his Own body, Mara said yes. Basically, yes. The student with the recording device lowered it slowly. One of the dark selenari lit up again faintly. Just a small glow, like someone turning a light back on very carefully to see if it was safe. Grak Sol, the largest of the Thargan students, was still standing by the wall. His arms were crossed. His jaw was set. He was not soft-looking in any way. He had 400 pounds of silicon-reinforced muscle and a face that had been built by a planet with twice the gravity of Earth. He looked at Jonah on the floor, and then he looked at the 2 white pills that were already dissolving in Jonah's system, and something moved across his face that was hard to name. He asked what the pills were. Mara told him. They were anti-inflammatory medication. She said they tell the body to reduce the fever slightly, not stop it. Just reduce it enough so the patient is comfortable while the immune system continues its work. There was another long silence. Then Grak Sol said something quietly, something he did not say to anyone specifically, just into the air of the room. He said, "So you quiet the warrior. Just enough so it does not exhaust itself while it wins the fight." Mara looked at him. She said, "Yes, that was exactly it." Grak Sol looked at Jonah on the floor one more time. Then he uncrossed his arms. He walked back to his desk. He picked it up off the floor where he had knocked it. He set it straight. He sat down. It was the most serious thing Mara had ever seen someone do with a chair. Elder Sivan stood in the center of the room for a long moment, looking at Jonah, and then looking at Mara, and then looking at his 43 students who were slowly, very slowly coming away from the wall. He said very quietly that he owed the medical wing an apology for the coat crimson. He said he had not understood the situation correctly. Mara told him not to worry about it. She said, in her experience, most people did not understand it the first time they saw it. She looked down at Jonah, who had fallen into a light sleep on the floor, his fever still running his body, doing what it had been designed to do. Across hundreds of thousands of years of being sick and surviving being sick and getting back up. She put her hand on his shoulder gently. Jonah was back in class 2 days later. He walked in with his bag over one shoulder, looking slightly tired, but otherwise completely fine. He sat down. He opened his notes. He smiled at Kel, who was sitting in the seat next to him now, instead of 3 seats away, and had clearly moved there on purpose. Kel stared at him for a long moment. Then she asked how he was. He said he was good. He said he felt a little tired, but otherwise fine. He said he had slept for most of the 2 days, and Nurse Osei had checked on him 3 times, which was probably more than was necessary, but he had not told her that. Kel stared at him for another long moment. Then she said very slowly that the Rethkai home world had a pathogen that caused elevated body temperature. In infected organisms, it was called the red decay. She said that when an Rethkai organism showed signs of elevated thermal output, the rest of the hive moved away from that organism immediately. She said the last documented case of red decay on her world had wiped out a colony of 40,000. She said their people had been afraid of body heat for 800 years. Jonah looked at her. He said he was sorry. He said that sounded terrible. She looked back at him, and something in her multifaceted eyes shifted. And she said yes, it was. And she said she was sorry she had tried to record his death. He blinked. He said he did not know she had done that. She said she thought it better he knew. She said she would delete it. She said it was not appropriate. She said she was very glad he was not dead. He said thank you. She said you were welcome. And then she turned back to her notes, and he turned back to his notes, and Elder Sivan began the class, and outside in the corridor, the world kept moving. But something had changed by the end of that week. The medical wing had a problem. Not a medical problem. A crowd problem. Mara had not said anything to anyone after the incident. She had taken Jonah back to the medical wing that first day, made him rest, given him water and food, and checked his temperature. Every 4 hours, she had written a report. She had sent it to the academy administration. She had gone back to work as normal, but the 43 students in that classroom had not gone back to normal. They had talked, and the people they had talked to had talked, and those people had talked to other people, and by Wednesday morning, there was a line outside the medical wing that stretched down the corridor and around the corner, and by Thursday, it had a waiting list. Mara stood in the doorway of the medical wing and looked at the line. It was not sick students. It was students who wanted to ask questions. She looked at the list of names. She looked at the clock on the wall. She looked back at the line. She sighed a very specific sigh that meant she had not asked for any of this, but she was going to do it anyway because that was who she was. She called the first name. It was a Solinari second-year student named Vale, who sat down across from her, very carefully, as if sitting too hard might cause offense, and said with great seriousness that she and 7 of her classmates had formed a study group, and they had many questions about human immune function, and they would be very grateful if Nurse Osei would consent to answer some of them. Mara told her to start asking. Vale pulled out a list. It was a long list. The questions went on for 2 hours. That was just Vale's group. After Vale came 2 rethink students who had read every publicly available medical document on human biology they could find and had flagged 14 things they did not understand. The first question was about scar tissue. What was scar tissue, and why did humans grow it instead of simply regenerating damaged cells? Mara explained that human bodies did not regenerate when tissue was badly damaged. The body filled in the damage with something tougher, something harder to break. It was not the original material, but in many ways, it was stronger. It was built to survive what had already hurt it once. The 2 rethink students looked at each other. They were quiet for a moment. Then one of them said, "So a human who has been hurt badly is in some ways harder to hurt in that same way again?" Mara said yes. That was essentially correct. They wrote this down very carefully then. They asked about bone density. Mara explained that human bones responded to physical stress by becoming denser, harder, more resistant to damage over time. A human who did hard physical labor or trained intensively for years would develop bones significantly stronger than an untrained human. The body rid the pressure put on it and responded by becoming harder to break. The rethink student put her pen down slowly and looked at her. She said, "So, if you hurt a human regularly, the human becomes more resistant to being hurt." Mara thought about how to answer that. She said yes. In a manner of speaking, the student said that on her world that was considered a feature of weapons, not of organisms. Mara did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing. Greg Sol came on Friday. He did not bring a list. He sat down across from her in the small chair that was clearly too small for him, and he put his large hands on his knees, and he looked at her directly with the very focused eyes of someone who has been thinking about something for several days and has finally decided to ask. He said he wanted to understand the adrenaline response. Mara explained it, a chemical the human body releases in moments of extreme fear or danger. It increases heart rate. It increases strength temporarily. It reduces the sensation of pain. It focuses the mind. It prepares the body to either fight or run in a situation where normal function would not be enough. He asked how much stronger. She said it varied. She said there were documented cases of humans lifting vehicles to free trapped people, cases of humans with serious injuries continuing to run or fight because the adrenaline had blocked the pain signals, cases of humans doing things under the chemical response that their bodies could not physically do under normal conditions. He sat with that for a while. Then he asked what happened to the human body after the adrenaline faded. She said it crashed hard. The body felt the damage it had been ignoring. The muscles ached. The hands shook. The person felt the fear they had not had time to feel before. Sometimes they could not stand up. She said it was not gentle. He nodded. Slowly, he said, "So in a moment of true crisis, a human body will override its own limits to survive the moment, even at the cost of damage afterward." She said yes. He said, "So the species will sacrifice tomorrow to survive today," she said she supposed. That was one way to put I was quiet for a long time. He looked down at his hands and then back up at her. He said on Thargan there was an old word for that kind of thing. It did not translate perfectly into the common tongue, but the closest. Meaning was something like burning the bridge to cross the river. He said warriors on his world trained for years to achieve that state on command. He said they almost never fully succeeded. He said it was considered the highest form of discipline. The ability to override the body completely in the name of survival. He said humans did it automatically, without training, without choice. Just because something was very wrong and the body decided to handle it. Mara looked at him. She said, yes, that was correct. He stood up and the chair looked very relieved. He stood in the doorway for a moment with his back to her, and she thought he was going to leave without saying anything else. Then he said quietly, without turning around, that when he had seen Jonah on the floor, he had been afraid. He said on his world, an organism radiating that much heat and losing consciousness was considered already gone. He said he had wanted to leave. He said he had pressed against the wall because something in him had known there was nothing to be done. He said he was glad he had been wrong. He left. Mara sat alone in the medical wing for a moment in the quiet. She thought about Jonah sleeping in her ward 2 nights ago. She thought about his fever running its quiet war inside him while he slept and knew nothing about it. She thought about how many times she had seen exactly that. How many beds, how many patients, how many fevers she had sat beside in her career. She had never once thought of it as remarkable. She was starting to think that might 3 weeks after Jonah fainted in xenobiology class, Grack Sol submitted his semester strategic analysis paper. It was titled On the Danger of Underestimating Biological Chaos as Evolutionary Strategy. The faculty board gave it the highest score any paper had received in 11 years. They were not entirely sure how to feel about that. The paper did not talk about weapons or ships or military tactics the way most Thargan strategic papers did. It talked about biology. It talked about humans. It was 47 pages long, and it began with a single line that the professor who graded it said he had to read 4 times before he believed. Someone had actually written it. The line said, humans are not a species that evolved to be strong. They are a species that evolved to survive being weak, and the difference is more dangerous than anything in the known galaxy. The paper then spent 47 pages explaining why it talked about the fever. It talked about scar tissue and bone density and adrenaline. It talked about the human immune system and the way it adapted and remembered and got smarter with every infection. It talked about the fact that human children on their home planet were exposed to hundreds of pathogens in their early years, and that the survivors, those who made it through childhood, came out the other side carrying immunity after immunity after immunity, a library of survival written into their blood. It talked about the fact that human history was full of plagues, events that had killed enormous portions of their population, diseases that by galactic medical standards should have ended them several times over. And each time, a portion of the population had survived, and those survivors had passed something on, something in the blood, something that made the next generation slightly harder to kill. Grack Sol wrote that most species in the galaxy evolved their defenses in advance. They grew armor or venom or speed or size they were built for the threats their planets offered. Before those threats ever appeared, humans, he wrote, evolved their defenses in response. He wrote that they had no armor, so they grew scar tissue. They had no natural weapons, so they grew adrenaline. They had no immunity to a disease, so they got sick and survived, and then they never got sick from that same thing again. They did not prepare for the threat, they absorbed it, and then they became resistant to it. They wrote that this was not a weakness disguised as strength. Wrote that this was a completely different definition of strength that the galaxy had not previously considered. The paper circulated quietly through the faculty. The biology department requested a copy. The medical research office requested a copy. Elder Sivan read it twice in his office alone, and then sat very still for a long time thinking about a boy on a floor and a nurse, who had not been afraid. Mara did not know about the paper at first. She was busy. The line outside the medical wing had not gone away exactly, but it had changed. It was less of a crowd now and more of a steady flow. Vale and her study group came back 3 more times. They brought more organized questions each time, and Mara answered all of them. She found she was starting to look forward to it, which surprised her because she had never thought of herself as a person who enjoyed talking. She was a person who fixed things. That was what she did. But these conversations felt a little like fixing something. Too, just something larger than she was used to. Kel came to see her alone one afternoon. She sat in the chair across from Mara's desk, and she did not have a list. She looked uncomfortable in the way people look when they are about to say something they are not sure they should say. She said she had been reading about human childhood illness. Mara said, "All right." Kel said she had read about a disease called chickenpox. She said she had read that human children were commonly allowed, or even in some historical periods deliberately encouraged to contract this disease so that they would be immune to it as adults. She said she had read that the disease in an adult human who had not had it as a child was significantly more dangerous. She said she had read that the common response was to expose children to the sick child on purpose. She said this in the tone of someone describing something that should be in a horror record. Mara said yes, that was correct. That used to be common before vaccines. Kel said, "What was a vaccine?" Mara explained. It was a medical technology humans had developed to teach the immune system to recognize a threat without having to actually suffer through the full disease. They introduced a small, safe version of the threat and let the immune system learn from it and remember it. And then when the real disease appeared, the immune system already knew how to fight it. Kel was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "So humans found a way to give their immune system the memory of a battle it never had to fight." Mara said yes. That was a very good way to put it. Kel said that on her world immunity worked differently. She said Rethkai bodies had fixed defenses. They were very strong against the threats of their home world and very vulnerable to anything new. She said that was why first contact with new species had always been so dangerous for them. She said the red decay had come from an off-world contact 800 years ago, and it had never come from a Vreth-Kai organism before, and their bodies had not known how to fight it. She stopped. Then she said very quietly that 30% of her species had died in that outbreak in 11 years. She said her people had never fully come back to their original population. Mara did not say anything right away. She looked at Kel sitting across from her with her shell slightly pulled in the way it went when she was sad, and her large, dark eyes steady and careful. Mara said she was sorry. She meant it. Kel said she knew, and then Kel said something that Mara was not expecting. She said that before last month she had been afraid of humans. She said not afraid exactly because she had not known enough about them to be afraid. She said she had found them confusing and soft, and she had thought the soft was the important part. She had thought soft meant small. She had thought it meant they were less. She said she did not think that anymore. She said she wanted to study human immune response. Formally, she said she wanted to submit a proposal to change her dissertation topic. She said she thought it was the most important biological research she could do. She said that if there was something in what humans had learned across all that sickness, all those plagues, all those years of surviving things that should have ended them, if there was something in that which could help her people. She stopped again. She pressed one of her smaller hands flat on the desk and looked at it. She said she thought it might be worth understanding. Mara looked at her for a moment. Then she reached into her desk drawer and pulled out a thick folder of documents. She said she had been collecting human immune research papers for 2 years since she arrived, because she had nothing else to read on her evenings off. She pushed the folder across the desk. She said, "Start here." Kel picked it up and held it carefully in all 6 hands as if it were something precious. She said. "Thank you," Mara said. "Do not thank me yet." She said there was a lot of dense material in there, and some of it was going to make Kel very uncomfortable. Kel said she thought she could handle uncomfortable. Mara almost smiled. She said yes, she thought so too. Jonah found out about Graxall's paper the same week. Vale mentioned it to him in passing, and he found a copy in the library database and read it sitting cross-legged on his bed in his dormitory room at 11 at night. He read it all the way through. He sat with it for a while. After, he did not feel proud exactly. He felt something stranger, something that was not quite pride and not quite sadness, and somewhere between the two. He thought about his grandmother, who had told him once that their family had survived the 1918 flu. He thought about his great-uncle, who had survived something worse. He thought about every person in his family tree. He would never know who had gotten sick and survived and passed something forward into the blood and the body and the generations until eventually it reached him. Thought about the way his body had just handled a fever without him knowing or deciding or doing anything at all. He thought about all the things his body knew that he had never had to learn. He put the paper down and looked at the ceiling of his small dormitory room on a space station 300 light years from Earth, and he felt suddenly very connected to something very old and very quiet that had been keeping him alive his whole life. Without asking for any, Elder Sivan called Mara to his office on a Thursday morning 6 weeks after the incident. She had never been to his office before. She had walked past the door many times, but had never had reason to go in. She knocked and he said enter, and she opened the door and found a room that was nothing like she expected. She had expected books and data pads and the organized desk of an academic. She found instead a room that was mostly dark, lit only by the faint blue glow of Elder Sivan himself, and full of things that were not books at all. Small objects from different planets, pieces of stone and shell, and something that looked like dried ocean plant, arranged very carefully on shelves along every wall. And in the center of the room a large chair, and across from it a smaller chair, and Elder Sivan standing between them, gesturing for her to sit. She sat. He looked at her for a long moment, and that way he had of looking at things as if he were reading something that was not visible to anyone else. He was 312 years old, and there was something in his eyes that was not quite sadness and not quite wisdom, but was what you got when wisdom had been alive long enough to know how much it still did not know. He said he had been preparing what he wanted to say to her for several days. He said he had written it out and read it back, and then deleted it and started again 3 times. He said he was not sure there was a correct way to say. She said she found it was usually best to just say the thing. He almost smiled. He said yes. He supposed that was the human approach. He folded his hands in his lap. He said that in 300 years of teaching, he had admitted students from 39 different species. He said he had watched young Thargan, who were strong enough to lift small vehicles, struggle to write a paragraph, and he had watched Rethkai students who could process information at 10 times the speed of most species, completely unable to function when separated from their hive mind for the first time. He said every species that came to the academy came with something extraordinary, and something that broke them a little, and his job for 300 years had been to understand both things. He said he had read Graxall's paper. He said he had also been reading the request submitted by Vale's study group, and the dissertation proposal submitted by Kel, and a formal research petition submitted by 6 faculty members from the biology and medical departments, all requesting expanded access to human physiological data. He said all of this had started with a boy on a floor and a fever. He looked at her. He said he wanted to ask her a question, and he hoped she would answer it directly because she struck him as a person who appreciated directness. She said she did. He said in 300 years, this academy had admitted species who were stronger than humans, faster than humans, longer lived than humans, more intelligent by standard measures than humans. He said by nearly every metric that the Galactic community used to evaluate a species' readiness and fitness for academic and broader social participation, humans were not near the top of any list. He said they were very new. He said they were very fragile. He said they had arrived in space only 40 years ago, and by galactic standards, that was still almost infancy. He paused, he said, so he wanted to ask her, how had they done it? How had something so fragile arrived here at all? How had they survived their own planet long enough to build ships and leave it? How had they kept going through everything their own history showed they had gone through? He said he was not asking as an academic question, he said. He was asking because he genuinely did not know, and it was the first time in a long time. He had genuinely not known something, and it felt important to understand. Mara looked at him. She sat back in the chair, and she thought about the question. She thought about it seriously, because it was a serious question, and he deserved a serious answer, and she did not want to give him something that sounded like a speech. Then she said, "We broke," she said. Her species had broken many times. She said there were plagues that had taken a third of their population, and wars that had taken more, and disasters that had taken whole cities, and long stretches of history that were so dark, she did not want to describe them in detail, but they were in the record. Anyone could read them. She said humans had done terrible things to each other, and been done terrible things by their own planet and their own biology and their own choices. She said every single time some of them had not made it, and every single time some of them had, she said, she did not know if there was a word in the common tongue for what that left behind in a species. She said in her experience humans did not think about it much. They just kept going. It was not a decision most of the time, it was just what the next morning looked like. You got up, and the morning was there, and you went into it. She said the body made that easier than it should have been. She said it was very good at deciding to survive without being asked to. She said maybe that was it. She said maybe after enough mornings, you stopped thinking about whether you could keep going, and you just did. Elder Sivan was quiet for a long time. The room was very still, and the only light was his soft blue glow, and outside the window the stars were doing what they always did, which was nothing except exist and be very far away. Then he said something quietly. She almost did not hear it. Said he had taught 39 species in 300 years. He said he had watched all of them arrive uncertain and afraid. He said he had watched all of them grow. He said that in 300 years, he had never once been afraid of a student. He said he thought he might be a little afraid of humans. She looked at him. He said not afraid like danger. He said afraid like the feeling you get when you stand at the edge of something very high and you know it will be important later that you looked over the edge, but in the moment, it takes your breath a little. He said that kind. He said it felt like standing at the beginning of something he would not live to see the end of, even with 300 more years. Mara did not know what to say to that, so she said what she always said when she did not know what to say. She said, "We will be fine." He looked at her. She said it with the calm of someone who had said it 10,000 times and meant it every single time and was not performing the certainty, but actually had it down. Somewhere deep past words, past thought, in the same place that the body knows to raise a temperature when something gets in that should not be there. He said he believed her. Stood up. She thanked him for the meeting. She told him she had 2 students coming to the medical wing that afternoon, and she should get back. She said if he ever had more questions, she was available. She walked to the door. He said her name. She turned. He said he was glad the academy had admitted the humans. She said she was glad too. She walked out into the corridor and the door closed behind her, and she stood in the hallway for just one moment alone in the regular light with the regular sounds of the station around her. Students moving, distant conversations. Somewhere down the hall, Grak Soul was walking toward the library, and he saw her from a distance and raised one massive hand in something that was not quite a wave and not quite a salute, but was clearly meant as respect. and she raised her hand back. Jonah was in the corridor too. He was walking with Kel side by side, and he was talking about something that made him use his hands too much, the way he always did when he was excited about something. And Kel had her head tilted in the way that meant she was listening very carefully and finding it interesting. She had 3 of her 6 hands holding the folder of immune research papers Mara had given her. She had clearly been carrying it everywhere Jonah saw Mara. He grinned. He waved. She waved back. He kept walking. He did not know that 43 students had thought he was dying 6 weeks ago. He did not know about the paper, or the study group, or the dissertation proposal, or the conversation that had just happened in a dark office with a 300-year-old professor who was quietly rearranging everything he thought he knew about fragility and strength. He did not know that he had changed something just by lying on a floor with a fever, doing what his body had been doing for 100,000 years before he was born. He was just a 22-year-old student with curly hair and a crooked smile walking to his next class on a Tuesday morning. And Mara Osei walked back to the medical wing past Greg Sol, who gave her that almost salute, past Vale, who bowed slightly. From across the corridor, past 2 rethink students who clicked their shells together in a pattern she had learned meant something close to good afternoon. She walked through the door of the medical wing. She sat down at her desk. She picked up the next file. She looked at the clock. It was a normal Tuesday at the edge of the galaxy, in a station that was 300 years old, surrounded by 47 kinds of life that had never imagined something as strange as her species. Completely normal, completely unbothered, and somewhere in the walls of that station, in the blood and the biology and the long memory of everything humans had survived to get here, the fever that had started all of this had finished its work and was gone. Body had